I'm speaking to you from the unceded territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam First Nations. And I'm so excited to be talking to you today and to be moderating this panel. It's a really special day. Today, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was among 100 Nobel laureates to release an open letter to government leaders gathering at the summit, calling for an end to fossil fuel expansion and a wind down of existing production in keeping with the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris Agreement limit, and to foster international cooperation for a fair energy transition. You can view the letter on our website, fossilfueltreaty.org. As heads of state gather at the Leaders Climate Summit, it's critical that the challenge of oil, gas, and coal expansion be addressed, and leaders commit to international cooperation to accelerate a fair energy transition at the pace needed, while also considering the needs of countries most dependent on oil, gas, and coal with low capacity to move away from them. So to start us off, let's hear what the Nobel laureates had to say. Thank you, Meredith. So I hope you could all see that. I'm not sure I could see it, but I heard in the chat that maybe participants couldn't. But please go to our website and see the Nobel laureate letter. But we're going to dig right in to our conversation. Today, we're going to talk about the need for a wind down and global just transition with representatives from a growing global movement of civil society organizations, Indigenous peoples, youth leaders, academics, faith groups, and cities joining together to call for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty to manage a global just transition away from fossil fuels in line with the Paris Agreement. Hundreds of organizations, institutions, individuals, as well as the city of Barcelona and the city of Vancouver in British Columbia have recently endorsed the concept of a treaty to phase out fossil fuels. Over 300 scientists and academics have also added their names to an open letter calling on governments to adopt and implement a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Before we get started, we actually have an exciting update from Councilmember Koretz, who sits on the Los Angeles City Council. Councilmember Koretz has represented the 5th District since 2009. As a member of the Los Angeles City Council, Councilmember Koretz has championed battling climate change, conserving water, and protecting natural resources. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Over to you.
Well, good morning and happy Earth Day week. First, I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking with you today from the unceded territory of the Tongva people who still live here today. Second, I want to thank Zipporah and your team for having me at this important event and for all the amazing work you're doing. And thank you especially to our host, President Biden. We appreciate all the terrific work that he's already doing in his short time in office. Before I tell you about what the LA City Council will be voting on today, I want to give you a specific example of why we need a justice-based, just transition off fossil fuels as we're hoping. When I was elected to the council back in 2009, and I was the first council member to sign on to the LA Beyond Coal campaign, our Department of Water and Power said it would never happen and told me I was crazy for even undertaking the effort. Thanks to an enormous years-long push from advocates like yourselves, this past December, we demolished once and for all the Navajo Generating Station, one of the largest, most polluting coal plants in the nation. This was an enormous win for the climate, an enormous win for community organizing as well. That plant and coal mine were responsible for an inordinate amount of air and water pollution inflicted upon the indigenous lands of the Navajo and the Hopi. Yet an even bigger tragedy may have occurred from closing down the Navajo generating station and the Kayenta coal mine which fed it. Doing so eliminated 800 indigenous jobs in a region where there are not many economic opportunities. And unbelievably, the Navajo and Hopi nations did not ever receive any power whatsoever from that generating station on their lands. Many, if not most, still live without running water or electricity. As we addressed the climate crisis, we found we needed a whole new approach so that Los Angeles is not the center of the extractive economy, but the center of a new holistic approach, a living economy where everyone benefits from the positive steps we're taking. So when I introduced legislation a few years ago in partnership with the LEAP LA Coalition to create the world's first climate emergency mobilization office, we wanted to center the office on environmental justice and equity to make sure that nothing like the Navajo generating station ever happens again, so that as we address climate, we raise all boats and leave no one behind, including the workers in the fossil fuel industry. Like the Navajo and the Hopi people who heroically supplied the city of Los Angeles with power for many decades. With a just transition firmly in mind, then I want to tell you that today the Los Angeles City Council will be voting on my resolution calling for the establishment of an international fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. What this means is that since, as a group of scientists wrote in January, we're still globally facing a ghastly future if we don't step up our climate actions, we desperately need to stop this madness. If you have lung cancer, you stop smoking. If your planet is overheating, you stop building fossil fuel projects. It's as simple as that. And we want as many cities as possible to sign on in order to encourage as many countries as possible to sign on. So what's so exciting about LA doing this is that a lot of folks seem to follow what we do, especially on environmental issues. And that is what gives me hope and keeps me going in the face of looming climate catastrophe. After we introduced the motion to create our climate emergency mobilization office, the city of Berkeley noticed what we had done and declared a climate emergency as well, followed by a number of cities around the Bay Area. Then London, England declared a climate emergency, and then the effort exploded. And now there are 1,926 municipalities that have officially declared climate emergencies. We're hoping the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty effort will take off in the same way. So wherever you are watching from, please take it to your city council and get it approved and join the effort. We're all in this together, and together is the only way we'll get out of it. The last thing I want to let you know is that our mayor just announced on Monday that we'll be building a solar plant to replace the Navajo generating station coal plant, and more importantly, to replace the jobs that were lost. That is climate justice. Thank you for listening and have a very happy Earth Day.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your leadership. You're right. A lot of people around the world have been watching LA and will be watching today as the motion goes forward for the treaty. Very excited. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
For those of you who are watching today and you'd like to learn from what LA is doing, not only in endorsing the fossil fuel treaty, but also putting in place policies at a local level to stop the expansion of fossil fuels, there's a bunch of resources for you. I'm going to ask the team at the treaty to put in the chat the campaign hub that they've been developing, which has resources if you want to ask your city to endorse the fossil fuel treaty. And then the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative has been partnering with a sister campaign called Safe Cities. Safe Cities has identified a number of different policy areas where cities themselves can take action, not just motions to endorse, but actually put in place deep policies to stop the expansion of fossil fuels. So take a look at those resources and case studies and join us. Stand.earth/safe. Okay, so let's go to our panel. So I have a number of amazing leaders from around the world who are joining this conversation today. I'd like to briefly introduce all of them and then turn right to questions and having the discussion. If you'd like to join us in asking questions today, at the bottom of your screen, you'll find a Q&A function. Please put your questions there. Again, if you're looking for interpretation, there's a little globe at the bottom of your screen. Click it and you can have this event translated from Spanish to English or English to Spanish. So we have joining us today, Mitzi Janelle Tan. She's the co-founder of Youth Advocates for Climate Action, the Fridays for Future of the Philippines, and part of Fridays for the Future International Community. We also have Harjeet Singh. Harjeet is the co-founder of Satat Sampada and supports the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative as strategic advisor of global partnerships. He has led ActionAid International's climate change work globally. Harjeet is an expert on the issues of climate impacts, migration, and adaptation, and supports countries around the world in tackling climate change. He's also a member of the United Nations Technical Expert Group on Comprehensive Risk Management under Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. Welcome, Mitzi and Harjeet. We also have with us this morning Rob Shirk, who's the Executive Director of Carbon Tracker in North America. Rob leads Carbon Tracker's outreach and data provision to the Climate Action 100+ initiative, as well as its work with securities market regulators and accounting standard setters around the globe to bring greater transparency to climate-related financial risk. Prior to joining Carbon Tracker in 2014, Rob was an Assistant Attorney General with the New York State Office of the Attorney General. Welcome, Rob. We also have Brenna Two Bears joining us. Brenna is Dene Ho-Chunk and Standing Rock Lakota. Brenna founded the Indigenous Peoples Education and Cultural Collective and supports the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative as the Fossil Fuel Phase-Out Communications Associate. She began her career fighting environmental racism in her tribal homelands from the age of 13. Since then, Brenna has focused on uplifting voices that often go unheard, including grassroots organizing, consultation on behalf of Indigenous communities, and working with youth. Welcome, Brenna. We also have with us today Tamara Tolles-O'Loughlin, is a renowned national climate strategist and environmentalist focused on equity, access, and community. Based in Baltimore, Maryland, she has 2 decades of cross-sector environmental experience as a campaign architect, movement-wide thinker, committed to advocacy and support of community capacity, mobilization, and access to opportunity. Tamara. Bill McKibben will be joining us, maybe not yet, but shortly. Of course, Bill is a founder and senior advisor emeritus of 350.org and the author of The End of Nature, among many other books, and regular periodicals and outlets like The New Yorker and Rolling Stone. He serves as the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College and Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And last, but certainly not least, we are very honored to have joining us today, Gregorio Mirabal. Gregorio is the General Coordinator of the Indigenous Organizations of the Amazon River Basin. He is Curupacao Indigenous leader from Venezuela and founding member of the United Multi-Ethnic People of the Amazonas Indigenous Movement. COICA is also live streaming this event to their members across the Amazon region, and we welcome you and your participation today. Welcome, Gregorio. So I'd like to start with you. Fossil fuels and climate change have disproportionate impacts on those living on the front lines of production. Gregorio, can you share your perspective with us on how Indigenous nations in the Amazon have been affected by oil development and the message that you would like to send to the heads of state gathering at the Leaders Climate Summit today?
En primer lugar, un gran saludo a todos y todas, hermanos y hermanas. Para mí, el día de hoy es muy importante. Hoy es el día 21 del año 21 del siglo 21. Hoy nuestro mensaje tiene que llegar. Nuestro mensaje tiene que ser oído y tiene que haber acciones. Hoy, cada 2 días es asesinado un líder indígena o una mujer indígena por defender la selva amazónica. Cada 6 segundos caen y mueren árboles de la Amazonía por la deforestación, por la minería ilegal, por el extractivismo, por los combustibles fósiles. Hermanos, quiero decir acá que la selva amazónica, nuestra madre selva amazónica, es un cuerpo que tiene vida. Si contaminamos con petróleo, con gas, con minería ilegal, estamos contaminando y destruyendo su sangre, la sangre de la Amazonía. Estamos destruyendo su sistema de circulación vital que nos da vida a todos nosotros. Están rompiendo los huesos con las maquinarias, con las máquinas, y muere la biodiversidad y mueren los pueblos indígenas y va a morir la humanidad. Es por eso que necesitamos frenar la invasión de nuestros territorios y frenar los asesinatos de nuestros hermanos. Es por eso que pedimos un gran favor al presidente Joe Biden. Necesitamos un acuerdo para frenar los combustibles fósiles. Necesitamos un acuerdo global, mundial. ¿Por qué? En los últimos 20 años se han invertido billones y billones de dólares para explorar y explotar la madre selva amazónica, la cuenca amazónica. Eso tiene que parar, porque si no paramos, presidente Biden, la Amazonía va a entrar en una etapa de colapso final y la humanidad también caerá con ella. Entonces, mi mensaje es: evitemos el colapso final, luchemos por la vida, paremos los combustibles fósiles. Necesitamos un acuerdo de no proliferación de combustibles fósiles a nivel mundial ya. Y usted, presidente Biden, es clave para ayudar a los pueblos indígenas del planeta. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Gregorio. It's an honor to have you with us today, and our hearts go out to the families and communities who are experiencing both this devastation and extraction in their traditional territories, but also the threats to their lives. I understand that I'm hearing translation simultaneously now. And I understand that our translation in the beginning, Gregorio, was not on. For those who missed Gregorio's opening statements, they are available in the chat. I'm just going to give you a sense of those. Actually, I'm going to turn to Greg. I was going to read them, but I think we have translation now. So I'm going to turn back to you, Gregorio. Originally, when we started speaking, we didn't have translation. So I'm wondering if you can, again, send your very clear message to the leaders of the Climate Summit, and also your encouragement on the treaty. And if there is anything you'd like to tell people watching today that they can do to support the nations, indigenous nations in the Amazon who are standing up against this extraction.
Gracias, tampoco tengo traducción. Ahora me llegó la traducción. Estamos diciendo desde la cuenca amazónica que cada 2 días asesinan a un líder y una lideresa indígena por defender las madres selva amazónica. Cada 6 segundos mueren y caen los árboles por la deforestación causada por el extractivismo, por los combustibles fósiles, por el gas, por el petróleo. Estamos pidiendo al presidente Biden que nos ayude a acordar que haya un pacto mundial, un acuerdo para frenar los combustibles fósiles en el planeta y especialmente en la cuenca amazónica. Porque si seguimos explotando el gas, el petróleo y la minería ilegal, estamos destruyendo el sistema de circulación de la sangre de la Amazonía. Estamos destruyendo, estamos quebrando los huesos de la Amazonía, de sus montañas, sus ríos, y vamos a morir los pueblos indígenas y el planeta se va a calentar, vamos a morir todos. Estamos a tiempo de garantizar la circulación vital de la Amazonía, sus ríos, sus bosques. Paremos en los combustibles fósiles. Por favor, presidente Biden, estamos diciendo que en los últimos 20 años han invertido billones y billones de dólares para explorar y explotar la Amazonía. Si no paramos esto con un acuerdo global, que liderice el presidente Biden a nivel mundial con Europa, con todos los seres de este planeta, con todas las potencias mundiales y el pueblo, la humanidad, entonces la Amazonía va a entrar en un colapso total final. Y si permitimos eso, presidente Biden, la humanidad también va a caer. Entonces, yo decía que hoy es el día 21 del siglo XXI y tenemos que hacer algo. Estamos a tiempo. Queremos un acuerdo global para frenar los combustibles fósiles. Necesitamos una nueva transición, una nueva sociedad, unos nuevos valores para entrar en equilibrio con la madre selva amazónica. Gracias.
Thank you so much, Gregorio. That was very clear and translated, so everybody could hear you. At Stand.Earth and also Amazon Watch, we're very honored to be partnering with you on the work to stop extraction of oil development in the Amazon. We're also calling on banks to stop investing in oil extraction in the Amazon and to stop oil trading. If you want to join us in that work, please join us at Stand.Earth and Amazon Watch. You can find more information there. There is new oil drilling planned today in the heart of the Amazon, in the Amazon sacred headwaters, in the buffer zones of indigenous nations, uncontacted indigenous nations. And this is reprehensible if we can't stop new fossil fuel development here in the heart of the Amazon, in one of the most important and critical places in the world. We're not going to be able to, certainly not going to be able to meet the goals of the Paris Accord. It's high time world leaders started listening to indigenous leadership and frontline communities who bear the brunt of the impacts of fossil fuel development. Around the world, they're starting to listen. And it's in part because of the incredible voices that have been lifting up these issues from the youth around the world. Mitzi, I want to turn to you. How has climate change impacted your life? And what is the message you and other youth leaders want to send to President Biden and others regarding climate change in action today?
Hey everyone, so I am from the Philippines, which is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to the climate crisis. We have the second highest number of internal displacements because of weather impacts. And we are hit by typhoon after typhoon, destruction after destruction. Last year, in the span of 3 weeks, we had 4 typhoons. I've had uncountable numbers of once-in-a-lifetime typhoons. I grew up being afraid of drowning in my own bedroom and having to do my homework by the candlelight because there was no electricity. Floods would reach up to 12 meters or 40 feet high and people would be stranded on rooftops. This is the reality of the climate crisis. Yet what we're seeing are these world leaders that continue to wave around their targets like net zero by 2050, like magic wands, as if this will solve things. Your magic wands won't do anything for us because your targets are still insufficient and full of loopholes and vague without any concrete plans and actions. We're still seeing so much support for fossil fuel industries, despite knowing as a fact that the fossil fuel industry is leading us to our destruction. And the reason why countries like the Global South, like countries like the Philippines, are so vulnerable to the climate crisis is also because of the systemic plunder of natural resources and human labor from the global north, from countries like the US. The US specifically has so many neoliberal policies in the Philippines that's causing our inability to adapt to the climate crisis. And so you already know your responsibility. You already know that this is something that you need to do, and what you've done already isn't enough. It's nowhere near enough, especially for countries like the Philippines who are facing the climate crisis every single day. We're supposed to be having committed climate policies that center the needs and demands of the most marginalized, but this isn't happening. We see it through all the dirty investments in fossil fuel subsidies, the relentless extraction of natural resources, the unjust and harmful trade agreements, the list goes on. And if things are kept this way, by the time you develop your so-called greener societies, the global south will have been living in an unprecedented catastrophe. But don't be fooled, sooner or later, the catastrophe will come to you too in the global north, in the US. We need to change. We need an end to fossil fuel investments and subsidies immediately. We need to prioritize and listen to the voices of the global south, the voices of our indigenous peoples, our farmers, our fishing communities, and we need to establish annual binding carbon budgets that factor in justice and equity, concrete plans, roadmaps, and milestones that get to actual net zero. And one of them, one of the most important ones, is ending fossil fuel investments and subsidies. This is what we need in order to survive. So let's not compromise on our lives. Let's not negotiate our way out of people's survival. So world leaders, if you're listening to this, brace yourselves, because the people, the youth, will not back down.
Thank you so much, Mitzi. Your courage and that of Gregorio and the people of the Amazon nations is inspiring. And that's what we need, because courage, well, courage can be contagious. We're going to be talking more with Mitzi and Gregorio as the event progresses to try and understand how we do this together. Because the fact is, we have the technology, we have the capacity to shift and ensure a faster phase out now. But as long as our financial capital, our intellectual capital, our political capital is still going to producing more and more fossil fuels, then we're not addressing the climate emergency. So we're going to be looking at how we do that. But I want to first turn to now to North America. Brenna Two Bears, can you give us a sense about the ways in which fossil fuel in extraction has impacted your 3 tribes in the United States? And why you feel a wind down of oil, gas, and coal and a fair transition is imperative?
Yes, thank you, Sephora. Yat she Brenna Two Bears Unishe, Twitter chini nishle, ta chini dashite, Unagire wang shik bashichin, Akot ego dine ado hochank asan nishle, Kinflanade nasha. Hello, everyone. My name is Brenna Two Bears, and I am Bitterwater Clan, born for Warrior Clan. My paternal grandfather is Standing Rock Lakota, and my maternal grandfather is Red Running Through the Water Clan. And in these ways, I am a Navajo, a Ho-Chunk, and a Standing Rock woman, and I'm from Flagstaff, Arizona. And I want to thank you all for joining us here today and for hearing these powerful words from Gregorio and Mitzi, and for the rest of our panel as well. I wanted to start off with addressing some of the issues that Councilmember Paul Koretz brought up when he was talking about the Navajo aquifer. This is something that I grew up hearing about. It's something that I saw in the backyards of my relatives and in our backyard. The water from the Navajo aquifer, which is considered one of the purest water sources in North America, was being used to slurry coal to benefit these cities that were outside of our tribal lands, off of the reservation, in Las Vegas, in LA, and everywhere except for where the people who were bearing the brunt of the negative side effects of this fossil fuel extraction, where we are not living. And this is something that I learned from my elders, something that I learned from my family members, from the organizations who are out there fighting this, when it was happening, such as Twa Nijona Ane, otherwise known as Water is Life in Navajo, as well as the Black Mesa Water Coalition. And aside from the fact that our tribes were the ones who were bearing the brunt of these consequences, we were also the ones who had our lands taken from us and stolen from us through colonization as well. And you see this in all of the other tribes that I am in, tribes across North America. In Standing Rock, we heard about the Dakota Access Pipeline, and that fight is still going on right now. We hear about the tar sands that are happening in the Great Lakes area. We hear about Line 3 that is currently being fought in Minnesota. In all of these different places, you hear an outcry from the youth, you hear an outcry from the elders, You hear an outcry from the communities and from people who are not in the communities. And I wanted to share with everyone something that my elders taught me, specifically within the context of the climate crisis, but also something that we have learned and that we have practiced for hundreds and thousands of years. Growing up, my elders taught me that I needed to consider every action I took as an impact on the next 7 generations. And we call this the 7th generation. And so we need to think about everything that we do and everything that the government is going to be doing and everything that our brothers and sisters are doing and how it's going to affect our family members for the next 7 generations. And for us, that's not something that is unseeable. They are our relatives. They are currently alive. That is someone that we need to consider with everything that we're doing. And so I just wanted to share that with everyone and let you all know that we need to address the racism and the imperialism that's at the root of the current climate crisis, starting with the frontline communities and emergence and developing countries that are at the front of all of these fights. And I want to thank you all for, sorry about that. I want to thank you all for joining today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brenna. It's a real honor to be working with you. And I want to remind folks today that while we were very excited on President Biden's first day that he canceled the Keystone Pipeline, there are Indigenous leaders who are standing up today and continue to blockade the Line 3 pipeline. We'll put a link in the chat where you can support them. And also the Dakota Access Pipeline. If we're going to stop fossil fuel expansion to align with Paris goals, we don't need these pieces of billion-dollar infrastructure. We need that money. We need that energy to all be going towards the world that we want to create. So we're excited right now to welcome Bill McKibben to the event. Someone who we all know has been talking about these issues for a very long time. I've learned so much from Bill. Bill, you've been a champion of calls for financial institutions to divest from fossil fuels in recent years with a huge impact. But we've talked before about how we can't just leave this up to the markets, that governments also have to take responsibility at this urgent moment. Can you share with us why you think governments also need to act and why a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty is needed from your perspective?
Sure. Zipporah, thank you for asking me. What a pleasure to get to join this panel. What an honor to get to follow Brenna. What fun to see so many colleagues up on this panel. Happy Earth Day, everybody. And just to, as I begin, just to echo your call around this fight over Line 3. Look, Minnesota was the center of all our attention yesterday, watching, if not justice, then at least some accountability begin to creep into, and that was only because people have fought so hard to make it so many of our colleagues and friends, but there's so many tired, hardworking activists in Minnesota still at work trying to make people understand that justice extends to things like stopping Line 3 too. So we really have them in our hearts today. And as soon as we're all vaccinated, we'll be able to join them in person. Look, we're obviously at an interesting moment in this whole long, endless climate fight. We're finally beginning to see world leaders talking in the right ways and saying some of the right things. Joe Biden tomorrow is going to call for a 50% reduction in US emissions by 2030, which is an awful big difference from where we were 12 months ago on the last Earth Day in the United States. But it's going to be a super hard job to get that done. And it must be said that even the best politicians are usually more interested in supporting the fun things, building out lots of EV chargers, putting up solar panels, whatever, than they are in saying no to the things that the fossil fuel industry wants to keep on doing. And at this point, we have to be able to do both. The pressure has to be as strong on governments to stop doing stupid fossil fuel projects as it is to start doing smart renewable energy projects. And that's why things like this fossil fuel treaty are so important. Ways to really get governments focused on the fact that there are two sides to this problem, a demand side and a supply side, and both of them are critical. You can't, I mean, we're going to have a hell of a time making the math work in any event, but we have no chance of making it work unless we're taking both sides of this equation as seriously as possible. And that's why this work is now so crucial, because we're at the point where the old arguments no longer apply. I mean, the argument always was, well, yeah, it's true. Coal and gas and oil are wrecking the planet, but what are we going to do instead? We now know what we're going to do instead. You know, the cheapest forms of energy on the planet are renewable energy. So there's no longer any kind of argument other than the argument from vested interest, the argument from this is what we always have done, the argument from rich and powerful people want us to keep doing this. And that's the argument that we have to break through, and we have to break through really fast. So some of it's being done on the front lines in Minnesota or the Dakotas or all the other places around the world where, you know, in Australia, where Aboriginal leaders are fighting hard against coal mine expansion, in Latin America, in the South Pacific, place after place after place. And some of it's being done at the highest levels of policy. That's why things like this fossil fuel treaty become so important. And one can almost sense that we're getting there, you know, to watch the United States put John Kerry, former Secretary of State, you know, usually called the second most powerful person in the United States, to have him assigned full time now to do nothing but try and get the world's governments on board around climate change is a sign of the gravitas with which the Biden administration, and I think the rest of the world, is now assigned this question. Our problem is that time is so short. We know that we have 8 or 9 years. That's what the scientists tell us. And that's the timetable that people like Biden seem to be agreeing to, even as we speak. If we're going to do it in 8 or 9 years, it's going to be an all out, all hands on deck effort. Part of that means making sure that Wall Street isn't supporting fossil fuel industry anymore. And that's why lots of us end up in jail from bank lobbies and so on and so forth. And part of it means that we have governments setting guidelines that they all can follow together that get us off this wheel right now. Because they're just, the problem is just physics. There's no more time to waste. And you know, we got to answer physics with justice, and that's what this entails now. So I am so grateful to Zipporah for all that your crew is doing, and we don't know if we're going to win this fight, but we do know by this point that we're going to have a fight, and that we've got a big, broad group of people across the world who are engaged in that fight. And what a pleasure it always is to get to be a little part of that.
Thank you so much, Bill. And we also know that every ton matters. Every ton that we emit, every ton that we lock in. And these projects not only are, of course, as we know, contributing to climate change, but once you start working on fossil fuels, you start to realize the health impacts of fossil fuels, the impacts that people are feeling on the ground. You know, which Gregorio and Mitzi and Brenna made so clear to us today. I know that this Earth Day is especially crazy busy for you, so we hope you can stay with us as long as you can, but we understand. I think you're also going to support the LA Fossil Fuel Treaty motion, so thank you so much for all of your work. I want to bring Harjeet, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. In the 2020 production gap report, the UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, Stockholm Environment Institute, and others identified that we need a 6% reduction in fossil fuel production per year through 2030, that we're currently on track to build 120% more fossil fuels than the world can burn under a Paris Agreement. So why are national governments failing to account for emissions that fossil fuel expansion locks in?
Thank you, Sephora, for having me and to share the panel with so many esteemed colleagues and activists. So yeah, I mean, it's really deeply worrying, and we need to hold leaders of the US. I mean, of course, we are seeing changes, but the legacy that it has got, and Russia and Canada to account, who are using fossil fuel exports now to justify increases in their oil, gas, and coal production. They need to wind down, and they need to wind down now. When you come to developing countries, the reality is different. You know, countries like Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, the situation is that there is hardly any support available to them to stop drilling and digging. Morally, we cannot ask them to stop using fossil fuels all of a sudden when they need a reliable source of energy to meet their basic and production needs. And the kind of financial support they need, that's not coming in. On the other hand, we know that people in the West have enjoyed the fruits of industrialization, have been living a decent life for generations. And now, because those decades of careless emissions have caused the climate crisis, we want everyone to stop using fossil fuels. That's unfair and unjust. So as a global community, we have a responsibility to support those countries and communities who had no role in causing the crisis. So financing remains a major challenge. You know, yes, the renewable energy investments are increasing, but they also face high risk of uncertainty. And many private firms are also unwilling to invest because of a very high degree of risk and problem of intergenerational returns. So while, you know, as we all acknowledge and know that the unit cost of renewable energy is going down, but when you go to developing countries, you still find there's a very high capital cost for infrastructure, for storage, for transmission. And if I take the case of India, which had put a very ambitious target of 175 gigawatt by 2022, the reality is it is also lagging behind. It's now at 93 gigawatt, which is close to 60%. And it also needs international finance and support. And that support is required across the board for policy framework, for capacity enhancement. So, and those countries also need predictability in terms of finance, because if they're going to change their policies, if they want investments to come in, that has to have a solid basis, a policy framework, and the certainty of money. So I think there's a huge gap in terms of, you know, how we are supporting that transition. And that's where this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty becomes really important, because we are putting a global just transition at the heart of it. Because as Paris Agreement, there is so much of talk about the cake itself, but we haven't talked about how to cut the cake. You know, who gives money, who takes up that responsibility, and who does how much. So, and for many leaders, it has been so convenient to keep talking about just the cake and not how to cut it. It's time to now look at the how part of it, the, you know, who needs to do how much, who needs to pay up how much. I think that's what is going to change the scenario, and that's what we need to focus on. That's the hard thing, and that's where the commitment is required to work across the board and across levels to make it happen. It's all about how now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Harjeet. And I'm going to go back in a minute to Gregorio and the how, because we've been having a lot of questions on debt. I mean, you know, when you talk about how and that some countries are in different situations, our research is showing that there are so many countries that even if they wanted to stop oil, gas, and coal expansion right now, they can't, because they're doing it just to feed their debt, or even in direct debt for oil agreements like Ecuador and China. These are some of the issues we need to explore under international cooperation. But before I do that, I want to bring in the voices of our final two panelists with a couple of targeted questions, parts of the conversation we haven't got to yet. Rob, so renewable energy prices are dropping all over the world, you know, to such an extent that now, you know, I remember the moment years ago when it was like solar's price parity with, you know, but now it's even cheaper in some places. So renewable energy is now affordable, reliable option. Energy forecasters have determined that 2020 is the year when demand for fossil fuels peaked, as you at Carbon Tracker predicted, even a little earlier. But at the same time, fossil fuel expansion continues to expand more than proposed. So how are the markets failing to address this production gap?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sephora. So, I mean, I would say that in some sense, some of the markets and some of the companies are seeing signs of exactly what you're saying, which is that times have changed. Some companies are recognizing we are at or we already have arrived at peak fossil fuels. You see in their corporate reports today recognition that access to capital is drying up. It's not dried up, but it is drying up. But the reality is, despite all of that, we do see that there's new capital that is going into greenfield projects all around the globe. And that's really the problem, is that we don't have any more time for that. So, to your question as to why that's happening, markets are very good at moving capital quickly, but unfortunately, they're kind of dumb at getting what the signal is. I mean, you could imagine and certainly hope that they would see the writing on the wall with what the objectives of the Paris Agreement were, but that's empirically not been the case. They need a signal that is sufficiently tangible to say, okay, enough is enough in this area. And that is what the treaty, and then of course the registry that would be supporting the treaty can help bring to this discussion, which is to say, there is this finite carbon budget. We know what it is, but we now need to apply that to the projects that are out there, both the existing projects and those that some companies would contemplate going ahead with.
So, and while I have you, just looking at the clock, we're not going to be able to get back to you. It's already 10 to the hour. I just want to ask you, can you say a couple of more words about the project that you're working on with Global Energy Monitor? Carbon Tracker and Global Energy Monitor are now working together for this global registry of fossil fuel production. So what will it do? Why do we need it?
Sure. So the Global Registry of Fossil Fuels is essentially a tool that's going to allow government, civil society, and other actors to be able to understand and have transparency over the issue of both the existing reservoir of fossil fuel reserves and resources, and then how those things might proceed in terms of production pathway going forward. So, there is a lot of information out there about reserves, but unfortunately, very little of it is available to the public. It's not, it's either held privately by governments with their seismic data, or it's held by third-party data providers. You have to pay tens of thousands of dollars to be able to have this information. We want to make that information readily accessible, and we want to make it so that civil society can easily ingest that information in the local context and understand what's going on locally for them, and how that does or does not fit into a Paris-aligned world. Some of the things that have come up already in the conversation today are going to be things that we're going to certainly touch upon in the registry. So we want to be able to produce data points of the type that can really be used in conversations between governments and conversations between civil society. So one data point, for example, would be things like tax takes from companies, for countries. Many countries don't earn that much from the fossil fuel production that goes on in their countries. How much is it? Maybe there should be a transfer of money, for example, as part of some negotiation in return for not producing some of these reserves and resources. So that would be one option. The second thing is that there are going to be all kinds of relatively dirtier projects in the world that some people may want to undertake. If we can create some transparency around that, that's all the more reason not to proceed with those projects. So we want to have an array of information like this that's going to be available for government and civil society to be able to move on this problem.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rod. I'm really excited about that new project. And it's kind of astounding that we don't have a clear global registry of who's producing what fossil fuels, and that governments aren't being held account for the production in their countries. I think this is going to be really significant. Let's turn to the United States. Tomorrow, the US has rejoined the Paris Agreement. The Biden administration included climate change as one of the 4 priorities. We've seen some incredible action over the last month. Can you provide some insight at the demands coming from vulnerable communities in the US as the reentry begins, and specifically where these demands connect to those of communities around the globe?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Zipporah. Communities across the United States, whether they are urban or rural, are looking for this administration in this pivotal moment in the climate decade beyond more than just like a demand set, but they're looking for ongoing partnership and investments and the end of coal, oil, and gas. We have ongoing needs for equity in the just transition and a pivot towards solutions that are inclusive, centered in community calls for real action rather than just tricky math or market-based schemes or technology that's uncoupled from the reality of life for workers and the communities that they return to. Our list of demands includes calls for multi-solving, attention to poverty and redress, as well as the opportunity to generate energy without erasure or harm and without ignoring the mistakes of the past. We can't just start today and act like the harm hasn't already happened. Communities want to be supported and not left behind as stranded assets, not often found on the balance sheet. We know how to innovate or to steward the land for food and energy and how to steward it for life itself, and have done so for millennia. So now is the time to broaden the conversation rather than revert to closed rooms, extensive experiments, and yesteryear best friends on this work, as well as proxy power, which doesn't give us enough action. It's time for us to demonstrate leadership and service rather than getting the band back together to talk about where we left the conversation.
We heard this morning from Councilor Koretz, and we know that New York is also considering a motion to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So what's the role of cities in encouraging the US to act? What do you think about these new endorsements on the fossil fuel treaty at a city level?
Well, just yesterday, AOC and Cori Bush launched the Green New Deal for cities and counties and towns and territories, which is a good sign that there's a lot of work that's going to be happening between the federal government and the state level and even municipalities. Cities are still calling for a Green New Deal. They're adding that demand to climate reparations and for more for deeper work. And so that really does connect to partnership in the treaty, which can and does add a traceable trajectory and multinational milestones that are tied to calls for actions happening in states and municipalities who are still in, for all intents and purposes, for solutions and the ability to build community-led resolutions in support of the treaty, campaigns which connect to local needs to disengage from fossil fuels, to disarm or our energy supply, and dig in on solutions that work for towns, cities, and every territory. From New York to Los Angeles to Wisconsin and Minnesota, there are real opportunities inherent in the things that we're currently in disagreement about for cities to lead the charge to end the status quo. And that can happen not just in big cities, but in small cities across the country who have a lot more in common with the global South than they do with the other parts of the global North.
Fantastic. Thank you. Fingers crossed on LA today. And, you know, I just want to let people know, given time and wanting to hear from all of these inspiring folks, we are answering the questions live in the chat. There are some of the folks from Treaty Initiative and other organizations are in there answering your questions live in writing. And I just want to, with the few minutes that we have left before I wrap up, I want to turn back to you, Gregorio. I have had the great honor of spending some time in the Amazon with many nations who are opposing oil development. And I think one of the things that sits with me the most today is how positive and hopeful people are, and the visions that are being created. You know, we hear a lot about Indigenous nations opposing the extractivist industries in their territory, but what I don't think the world has heard much of is the vision that we're seeing emerge, the life plans, the vision of sustainable economies that are informed about the connection and that we have to the earth and living systems. Can you tell us a little bit about the life visions that are emerging from Indigenous nations and the steps that you think need to be taken now in order to actually see some of those positive visions become a reality?
Gracias. Para saber si hay traducción, si se oye. ¿Sí me oyen? ¿Sí hay traducción? ¿Sí me oyen? ¿Ustedes? ¿Sí?
Yes, we can.
Ok, gracias. Es para no repetir otra vez. Nosotros creemos que el mundo ha roto su relación con la naturaleza. Nosotros estamos muy indignados, muy tristes porque los seres humanos, la industria, las empresas, los gobiernos están viendo la naturaleza como una mercancía, como algo que se puede romper, explotar, destruir. En nuestra cosmovisión, decimos los pueblos indígenas, nuestro plan de vida dice, nuestras normas ancestrales dicen que tiene que haber un equilibrio. Tenemos que respetar la naturaleza. Es nuestra casa. Ella tiene vida. Y cuando rompemos el equilibrio, cuando la destruimos, estamos generando enfermedades. Estamos generando pandemias. Estamos generando destrucción de nuestro entorno, de nuestra vida, de nuestra relación con la naturaleza. Entonces, nosotros necesitamos sanar, necesitamos hacer un acuerdo de convivencia nuevamente con la naturaleza a nivel del planeta. Nuestro plan de vida en la Amazonía lo hacemos con nuestras guardias indígenas territoriales, con nuestra medicina tradicional, con nuestro sistema económico que se basa en la reciprocidad, en el intercambio. Pero el modelo de desarrollo mundial dice que nosotros, nuestra economía, nuestra filosofía, nuestra forma de vida está opuesto al desarrollo y eso es falso. Está demostrado. Este modelo de desarrollo extractivista de gas, de petróleo, de energía fósil está destruyendo el planeta. Nuestro modo de vida dice que el 80% de nuestros territorios son los mejores conservados del planeta. Todavía hay biodiversidad, todavía hay agua potable, hay ríos, hay montañas. Donde está el otro modelo, solo hay desierto, solo hay contaminación, solo hay destrucción. Esa es la reflexión que hacemos al mundo. Por eso tenemos nuestra Asamblea Mundial por la Amazonía, donde queremos que ustedes nos ayuden a valorar lo que estamos haciendo, a defender lo que estamos haciendo, a hacer a entender al otro mundo de que nuestra visión, nuestro plan de vida puede salvar el planeta.
Thank you so much, Gregorio. I'm going to ask our tech support to bring everyone, all of our amazing panelists to the screen now so you can see them all. It is an incredible honor to be sharing this Earth Day 2021 with all of you. I know how busy you are, especially today. So thank you so much, all of you, for joining us. And I think appropriate that our final speaker today was Gregorio. We're very honored that you were able to join us today and bring the voices of Indigenous nations in the Amazon together with us. If we could bring up also all the images of all the panelists Just to conclude, as leaders gather today at the Climate Summit, we urge them to act quickly to stop the expansion of oil, gas, and coal. Our work to address the climate emergency will be undermined as long as the fossil fuel industry continues to expand. Adding more projects now, LNG in Canada, Argentina, and other regions, new oil sands pipelines like Trans Mountain in Canada and Line 3 in the US, new oil drilling in Guyana or Uganda, or even in the heart of the Amazon sacred headwaters in Ecuador, new coal mines in India, expansion of fracking and oil drilling in the US and Texas and New Mexico, or in Colombia. These are all projects the world can no longer afford. We ask our world leaders to listen to frontline communities, to Indigenous leaders around the world calling for urgent domestic action and international cooperation to end expansion now, and focus on fast tracking a global just transition with renewable access for all. If your house is on fire, you don't add more fuel, and that's exactly what's happening. It will take courage. It will take new policies and agreements, and that's why we're asking all of you who joined us today to endorse the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, to divest, and to join youth from around the world in organizing, in striking, in making your voice heard at this critical moment in history. To continue the conversation, join us at fossilfueltreaty.org. Check out our session, Building Power After Biden's Climate Summit, a Global Youth South Perspective, this Friday at PowerShift 2021. And most importantly, continue to spread the word, continue to stand up, continue to organize, and stay safe. Thank you to all of you who joined us for this Leaders Climate Summit event, and happy Earth Day.